All right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Rawan Osman, a Syrian-Lebanese writer and activist, and the founder of Arabs Ask, which is a platform aimed at fostering dialogue between Arabs and Israeli Jews. Rawan joins us this afternoon to discuss her journey from anti-Semitism to Zionism. Ms. Osman will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Rawan Osman.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. And allow me, before I start reading, to begin with the events in the Netherlands. And I say that because we've seen what happened in Amsterdam. And today I was watching a disturbing video from Antwerp, where Arabs, it seems, harassed a Jew who physically was recognizable, unprovoked. They beat him up. And I'm just wondering who is recording the video footage and sharing it. In Amsterdam, in Antwerp, it seems that it's become a trend, something we've seen on October 7th. And the world accepting this would be encouraging this trend of a sadistic behavior. I live in Europe and I watched the dramatic transformation in the last decade. In 2015, when Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das," we will manage, we can do this, I thought, wow, what a mensch. She's one of the few brave leaders to welcome Syrian refugees with an open heart, open arms, but I also thought we are doomed, especially in Germany, which is still in the process of repairing the damage done to the world's Jewry. Germany was welcoming 1 million Syrians, mostly anti-Semitic and misogynist Syrian men. I hope the government understood what it was doing and that they had a plan. Unfortunately, they didn't. The Germans were shocked when they heard of gang rape incidents, of sexual harassments, of domestic violence. Maybe some of you have seen a Syrian man back in the days stabbed his wife to death and posted the video on Facebook while he was running from the police, while the knife was still in his hand and his son by his side. To me, that was inevitable. How do I know? I'm a Syrian woman. I'm a recovered anti-Semite myself. I bought Mein Kampf in Damascus for less than $1. Maybe some of you recall also in Berlin when a Syrian teenager took his belt off and belted a stranger on the street because he was wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, and he was shocked. He kept crying, "Are you a Jew? Are you a Jew?" And I understand. It was his first time to see a Jew because I have been in his shoes. Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, as well as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and several other nonsensical anti-Semitic publications are available, translated and accessible, especially near international hotels in the Arab world. In 2011, I moved to Europe. I lived in Strasbourg in the Jewish quarter in France, and my accommodation happened to be in a quarter that was filled with Jews. On the first day, I went shopping in the grocery store across the street from where I was staying, and I was happy because I found all the ingredients I needed, even the spices. I heard men entering the store, and I heard them speak. And then I realized it was Hebrew. I had a panic attack. It was the first time in my life, I was 25, 26, where I was sharing the same space with the Jews, with the enemies. Otherwise, where would I have ever had contact with them in Syria or in Lebanon, where I grew up? I wanted to know, why were the Jews the enemy after having a panic attack? And I realized that most of what I know about the Jews and Israel, I learned and internalized from Hezbollah in Lebanon, where I grew up, from Hezbollah's Secretary General, Nasrallah, who was recently assassinated in Beirut. He vowed to take Palestine back from the criminal Jews. I was watching the Jews over months from my window in Strasbourg, and the Jews did not look criminal to me. I learned that they were evil, but they seemed nice. Down the road where I was living, there was a big building. And I asked my friend back then, why are the Jews so obsessed with this museum? There must be different attractions in the city. And he told me, darling, that's the synagogue. I've never seen a synagogue till then. Like the hotel. Maybe I'll skip this part to give more time for questions. That experience, what happened in Strasbourg, changed my life, opened my eyes. In Europe, when I had access to uncensored information, I started reading about the history of our region, the Middle East, the history of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate of Palestine. And I could not believe how misleading the information we were taught. And I was very angry. The so-called Palestinian cause led to the death of hundreds of thousands, all of which could have been avoided had the Arabs accepted to share the land with the Jews. I attended the French Catholic school in Lebanon. Part of the official history curriculum is a lesson about Palestine, one lesson. It is 2 or 3 pages, and it tells the story of the Zionists. The antagonist of the story is, of course, Theodor Herzl, who created the so-called Zionist movement. We learned the date of the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, and that the Jews came from Eastern Europe, and they had planned to steal Palestine. And that implies that Palestine was a country with specific political borders. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, the British, who thought they could keep the area that later became Israel, called it the British Mandate of Palestine. And that was the name given to the province by the Romans after they destroyed the Jewish temple in year 70. The romantic idea of a Palestinian national identity is invented to counter and reject the Jewish narrative. And it is working, and it has caused a lot of damage, and it continues to Israel, but also to the Palestinian Arabs. The Palestinian National Project failed to achieve its ultimate goals. Number one, to eradicate Israel, and number two, to establish a sovereign Palestinian state. It failed because the Israelis are resilient and persistent and organized. It failed because establishing a state requires statesmen, and the leadership of the Palestinian camp has always been involved in corruption or terrorism, or both. Anti-Semitic propaganda brainwashed, and it continues to brainwash, tens of millions of Arabs who believe whatever they are told about the Jews. They also have never met a Jew. Nearly 800,000 Jews left the Arab world due to pressure, intimidation, or persecution. Historians estimate that the size of the assets that the Jews left behind in the Arab world is approximately the size of Lebanon and Jordan combined. Apropos Jordan, The world is obsessed with the West Bank. How about we take a look at the East Bank of the Jordan River? East of the river is Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom, the country that was created and given its independence in 1946. The governing royal family comes from the Hejaz region in today's Saudi Arabia. Why aren't the locals revolting? Why does it bother nobody on the planet that a large chunk of land was carved and offered to that family? And the Jews who originate from the region, according to the Bible and the Quran, according to historical and archaeological evidence as well, are labeled as thieves. The Palestinians talk until this day about the population transfer they suffered from upon the foundation of Israel. Israel did not become a country overnight. For nearly 5 decades, the Jews tried to establish some Jewish state in their historical land, where their history took place around Jerusalem, Jericho, Safad, Hebron, those places mentioned in their Bible. The Ottoman Sultan refused, and upon the collapse of the Ottoman Empire around 1915, the Arab rejected the idea categorically. They refused to share land with the Jews, and the very notion of the Jews governing was out of the question. Arabs and Muslims in general argue that they aren't anti-Semitic, but rather anti-Zionist. They claim that the Jews were living safely and peacefully under Islamic rule. But before Israel became a subject, Muslims treated the Jews fairly, really? Before Israel became a country, how about maybe a quick reminder of the Aleppo riots, the Farhud, the Aleppo riots in 1947, upon the Syrian authorities learning of the UN partition plan. The Farhud in Baghdad in 1941, also incited by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem from Berlin, where he was at the time, through Radio Berlin. How about the Hebron massacre in 1929, where Jews, not Ashkenazi Jews, they did not come through the first or second Aliyah. These were Jews living in the land for centuries, were massacred by their Muslim Arab neighbors. So the Damascus affair in 1840, these were incited by libels. But if we go back even to the 18th century, forget about the blood libels imported from Europe. How did the Zaydis in Yemen treat their Jews? I'm just going to mention briefly 2 examples for those who claim that the Muslims were never anti-Semitic. The Orphans Decree and the Dung Gatherers Decree. The Dung Gatherers Decree assigned a job to Jewish men. They had to clean human feces, carcasses, bodies, and nobody cared if you're an observant Jew, keeping Shabbat. If you're a Kohen, you couldn't touch a dead body. And the worst was the Orphans Decree, allowing Muslim men to take the children of a Jewish man who passed away. The Muslims until this day claim it was done out of the good of their hearts, but I'm not sure this is how the mothers or the Jewish communities perceived it at the time. Let's say that October 7th was a culmination of anti-Jewish sentiments in the Muslim world. Anti-Semitism in the Arab world must be addressed, researched, and cured for the region to know peace. Let me tell you what I saw in 2 months I spent in Israel in the summer. I saw parents who lost their children and who are still talking about peace with the Arabs. They lost their children, but not hope. Every family has 1 or more members in the army. When they are called for duty, they go and their family knows they might never see them again. Israelis ask me, why do they hate us so much? How can anyone accept what Hamas has done on October 7th? I can explain that Arabs are brainwashed to hate them, but I fail to understand what is happening today in the West. I tell them I don't know why can anyone accept what Hamas has done. Since the attack on the Twin Towers in the US in September 11, we all know that the perpetrators of terror attacks share the same ideology. They are Muslims who were radicalized. And yet, in a cynical plot twist, many around the world think that such terrorism is understandable when it happens against the Israelis. I translated many of the videos that were filmed and shared by Hamas on October 7th, and such cruelty is unimaginable. Even ISIS, when they executed people, and I'm Syrian, I cannot believe I'm saying this, when they executed people and shared the videos on YouTube, even ISIS members did not gloat and cheer in the background. You know who else suffers from radical Islam? Everyone in the Muslim world, even minorities. Every minority and every Muslim who disagrees with extremists. The problem is not Israel. Israel did not want or start this war. Not with Hamas, not with Hezbollah. The problem is radical Islam, and it is time for clarity. It is time to say enough, and it is time to call a spade a spade. If what happened in Amsterdam is tolerated, we are doomed in the West. These mobsters maybe were provoked, but I should remind everyone that these men deal with problems in the same fashion, whether it's Israelis or their wives, their sisters, their children, anyone in the West who dares disagree with them. And with that, I will end, and let's open it for questions. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. That was a very eye-opening presentation, and we have a number of questions that are coming in. I'll begin with one from Andrew Rosemarine, who is an international lawyer based in the UK, who asks, what must we Friends of Israel do to encourage Israel to improve relationships with moderate Syrians and Lebanese?
I don't think Israel is the problem. You don't need to encourage the Israelis to do anything. The Israelis helped the Syrians. They treated them in Israeli hospitals. And the Syrians living in Europe never forget that. The Israelis are ready for peace. They cooperate sometimes under the table with the Lebanese and the Syrians who are open for that. There is potential there. But the problem is, what can you do as a friend of Israel to encourage the Syrians and the Lebanese, especially those living in the West, who do not suffer the consequences of anti-normalization laws and policies? They won't be arrested or executed. How can you encourage them to engage Jews and Israelis in Europe, to understand that at least the Israelis' position? That would be a starter.
All right, thank you. Now, Europe has come up a few times, and the sheer number of migrants that have entered Europe from the Middle East and North Africa and even parts of South Asia since 2015 is hard to wrap your head around. What do you think that Europe can do to curtail the damage from the massive influx of anti-Semitism in their society in such a short time?
A quick response would be, we are doomed, too late. Too little has been done. But I'm an optimist. And people think sometimes I'm bigoted against the refugees. I am Syrian myself. My brother and mother came to Europe as Syrian refugees. The problem is that the West let the Syrian people down. They allowed al-Assad to get away with everything he's done to the people. The Democratic administration back then, Barack Obama, when he told al-Assad, don't you dare use chemical weapons against the Syrians, or else. Al-Assad used chemical weapons against the Syrians and nothing happened. And the West let the Syrian people down until the Syrians walked over to Europe. A buffer zone should have been created around Syria for those who needed to escape the tyranny, or at least those who weren't involved in politics. Now it is too late. A lot of people came over to Europe, and from here, they're going everywhere else. We need strict regulations. We need serious consequences. But that said, when I hear politicians in the Netherlands saying that the consequences of what happened to the Israelis in Amsterdam would be cutting social welfare to refugees or those who are being processed, I cannot fathom I don't understand what is the strategy there. I must remind you that people are not totally stupid. Those who have beaten the Israelis up were probably born in the Netherlands. So speaking of deportation or cutting social welfare is not effective. Too late for that. We need measures and we need consequences. Not saying it was tit for tat, so it's acceptable. The Israelis provoked them, so it's okay for them to beat them up. They recorded this footage. It's a sadistic behavior that we are encouraging. We cannot let them go. They have to face serious prison time. What else can be done? I don't know. If you can deport them, good luck. But I don't think those who have residencies or passports are welcome back in Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia. I'm talking specifically now about Amsterdam because I recognize the dialect and they were speaking in French, so they come from Northern Africa. The Syrians, the Afghanis, if they don't have residency permits, you can send them back. If their countries take them back, there are no diplomatic relations, you cannot send them back. So we are kind of stuck.
Well, thank you. Now, to follow up on a similar note, has Angela Merkel accepted any responsibility for the cultural and ideological changes facing Europe for the last decade or so, particularly after the events in Amsterdam the other night?
Why should she? She should be invited to revise or reflect on what she's done. But now she's not in office. She's gone. What's done is done. So we are paying the price for a decision made by someone who thought she's a humanitarian and she's doing her moral obligation, fantastic, but the repercussions are not so well for the entire planet because what started in Europe that did not spare New Zealand or from New Zealand to Canada. It's stretching and it will contribute to the rise of the far right everywhere.
Right, thank you. Gonna move on to a question here from, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, Ira Puratian. Why do Muslim clerics not make the Muslim world aware of the few pro-Zionist verses in the Quran? And I assume this question is referring to the verses in the Quran that acknowledge the fact of Jews being indigenous to Jerusalem.
Not to Jerusalem, I must say, because Jerusalem is mentioned 0 times in the Quran. We're talking about a land that was given to Bnei Israel, to the children of Israel, to the Jews. And most Muslims who have never met a Jew have heard a lot about Jews and about Bnei Israel in the Quran. They know that these people are indigenous to the land. So let's stop talking about those who came from Eastern Europe. Even if they traveled back from Eastern Europe, if they lived there for centuries, they are indigenous to the Middle East. They're part of our cultural fabric. However, it's a very good question. Where are the Muslim clerics? Anybody can issue a fatwa in Islam, and we need to address that. We need a solution. Anybody can say, I don't know, it is haram, it is not allowed, or I issue a fatwa, you should kill X or Y because they did something wrong, and people will feel like it's their religious obligation, they will do it for a good cause. After a teacher was decapitated in France, President Macron, who believes in diplomatic solutions, called upon clergies, Muslim clergies in France to come and address the issue. He called for clarity. for them to condemn, I'm assuming, what has happened, so that we avoid that happening again and again. And since then, we heard nothing. They are either intimidated by extremists or they are secretly extremists themselves. And speaking of the Quran, of course, it acknowledges that the Jews are our cousins, they come from the region, but we have controversial verses who tell a Muslim, for you to be a good Muslim, you have to chase them because they are the cursed ones. And everybody should be invited to join Islam, whether they like it or not. So we need theologians, we need imams, we need establishments to address this, to convene from all over the planet and give clear messages to these young men on what is acceptable and what is not.
Yeah, well, thank you. Sorry, there's a lot of questions coming in. Some of them are very long as well. Here's a question from Bull Duang, who asks, we know the UN and all international bodies are heavily biased against Israel and are dominated by those sympathetic to Islamists. Do you see this changing without dismantling these bodies, i.e. the UN, Doctors Without Borders, WHO, etc.?
We don't need to dismantle these bodies. I don't know if our world would be better without the United Nations. Its purpose originally was good. Now, if we're talking about the UNRWA, that's a completely different story. Definitely, we should have dismantled it yesterday. It should disappear. No mercy. However, these international bodies should be cleaned up, not dismantled. It takes a lot of effort to bring people together from around the globe, to get them to work together. But if most of them are biased or anti-Semitic or have strong opinions about the Arab-Israeli conflict without being able to locate Israel on the map, that becomes problematic and we should call that out. I'm hoping, I'm going to say this out loud, I'm hoping that the Trump's administration will help the world navigate our way out of this mess. I hope they are strict enough on Iran because I don't know if people have this sense of urgency, but we are currently witnessing the final battle in a war that is 1400 years old. It's a vendetta between Shia and Muslims, and we are stuck in between, and the pretext is Jerusalem. That's not mentioned once in the Quran. They are fighting over who's going to dominate the Middle East region and recruit, appease, satisfy all these Muslims around the world and join a fascist camp on Russia and China's side.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more here. Now, of course, anti-Semitism is very pervasive in Lebanon and Syria. How pervasive would you say similar sentiments expressed against other religious minorities like Christians, Druze, atheists, etc.? How prevalent is that across Lebanon, and how does that translate when those people are imported into Europe or into the West?
I love the question. Thank you so much for bringing this up. It's never only anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiments, because people like to argue, I'm a Semite myself, how can I be anti-Semitic? But that's a big discussion, the term anti-Semitismus, etc. So it's not only anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish sentiments, it comes in a package. It's anti-LGBTQ, it's anti-women, anti-freedom, fascism. It is anti every other minority. Take Lebanon, for instance, what's happening now. Lebanon is not like Hamas, and I'm often asked in Israel, like, is this the same? No, not at all, because there are minorities in Lebanon. They survived, many of them left, but there are minorities who experience this hatred themselves. Take the Maronites, for example, and they know what Islam thinks of them. Think of the Copts in Egypt who are treated, who are assaulted, harassed. In the same manner, the Israelis were in Amsterdam. Think of the Kurds, of the Yazidis. People claim, or Muslims, or in the culture, there are beliefs that the Yazidis worship Satan because they worship the fire, that the Druze endorse incest, that the Shia have a tail, that the Jews have horns. And these convictions that are baseless are normally used to harass and persecute minorities, and I named a few. But we know this in the Middle East and Northern Africa. The majority, who is king, the Muslims, especially the Sunnis, and minorities suffered under Muslim rule for 1400 years. The privileged ones, imagine, are the Christians and the Jews who enjoyed the dhimmitude status. These were the ones who were protected as long as they knew their place, as long as they paid the jizya, the tax. And if for any reason people would have a go at them or rape their women or steal their money or refuse to pay a debt, then the authorities would often turn a blind eye. And this was a privilege exclusive for Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. The others suffered hell under Muslim rule. And if the Muslims are truly interested in peace in this world, they should acknowledge that they've been unfair. They should exercise some introspection, reflect on this history, and maybe offer the people they ruled for so long some justice, a different system, perhaps, so that we can avoid more death and more misery.
Well, thank you so much. We have unfortunately reached the end of today's podcast, but I want to thank you again for taking the time to give us that wonderful presentation.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone listening. Thank you.
Of course. Now, before we go, is there somewhere our audience can go if they would like to follow more of your work?
I think my biggest audience is on Instagram. So if you go to @Rawan Osman, RAWAN OSMAN 2024, you would find me there. You'd find me on every platform, but I post mostly on Instagram.
All right, great. For the future, when this episode will be on YouTube, I will be sure to put that in the video description below. Now, for our viewers and listeners, we thank you all again for joining us. Please keep an eye on your inbox. You'll get an invite to Wednesday's Ashley Perry Israel Insider podcast at 3 p.m. And if you have not done so already, please subscribe to the Middle East Forum's YouTube channel, where you can watch this episode as well as over 400 of our past podcast episodes. As always, we thank you all again for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.